So now we switch, remembering that we're still about perceptions. We're still about, to understand alcoholism, you have to understand alcoholics, and to understand alcoholics, you have to understand alcohol. So now we're going to switch to sort of the same point, the reality and the perception. And we're going to do this in a little different way. What I'm going to do is present you nearly a dozen professional definitions of alcoholism, drug addiction, same thing. And what I'm going to ask you to do is look for the common denominator. Remember when you were in school and they were teaching you math and you say, let's find the lowest common denominator. Well, pick out from these definitions, and they're going to come from a long time ago to the American Medical Association, the World Health Organization, the National Council for Alcoholism. So we're going to look at the pros and what the pros have said over years. We'll start with the oldest, except for one. I'll save the very oldest till the end. And we're going to keep looking for what do they all agree on. All right? If we ask them to sit here and fight it out, what would end up as we all agree to these things? We all agree to these elements. You're looking for that. A couple of the definitions are probably too short for that purpose because they're so trimmed down that you'd only need to hear those and you'd be finished. So you have to put those aside, but remember them at the end. So here we go. Dr. E M Jelinek was the head of the World Health Organization's Committee on Alcoholism. He wrote a book called The Disease Concept of Alcohol. So the disease concept has been around since Jelinek wrote that book in 1960. And what Jelinek claimed, and you're going to see it's very familiar as time goes on because a lot of people follow the World Health Organization. But in 60, Jelinek said that alcoholism was any use of alcoholic beverages that causes any damage to the individual or society or both. Hang on to that, but don't be stuck with it. That's too short. So let's look for a longer, meatier definition. And what we find is that the American Medical Association in 1986, they defined alcoholism as an illness characterized by preoccupation with alcohol and loss of control over its consumption, which usually leads to intoxication if drinking is begun, by chronicity, what that means is that once you got it, it doesn't go away, by progression, keeps getting worse, and by tendency toward relapse, by a tendency to going back to the drug after you've said, I've had it, no more. It is typically associated with physical disability and impaired emotional, occupational, and or social adjustments as a direct consequence of persistent and excessive use of alcohol. 1968, the American Medical Association, in its manual on alcoholism. So what does that have in common with the first definition? That's what you're looking for, the common denominator. In 1970, two fellows wrote a book called The Action of Alcohol, and Barry and Walgren in 1970 defined it in this way. They said alcoholism, quote, includes 3 criteria, all of which must be present for the person to be regarded as an alcoholic. A large quantity of alcohol consumed over a period of years. B, abnormal chronic loss of control over drinking. And C, the drinking causes chronic damage to physical health or social standing. Meatier definition. So let's see what persists as time goes on as essential to the notion of alcoholism. So we'll look at the major group that is sponsor of this program. They're the National Council on Alcoholism. And their definition in 1976 was that alcoholism is a chronic, progressive, and potentially fatal disease. It is characterized by tolerance and physical dependency, or pathologic organ changes, or both, all the direct or indirect consequences of the alcohol ingested. They went on in this article to say, the person with alcoholism cannot consistently predict on any drinking occasion the duration of the episode or the quantity that will be consumed. NCA in 1976. What has persisted? What's left over? What the first several experts agree on? University of Maryland professor who was responsible for treating alcoholics in this city for many, many years, good friend of mine, Charlie Whitfield. Charlie wrote a lot of things, and the one definition that persists through all his writings sounds a lot like the World Health Organization. Charlie defined alcoholism as any use of alcohol that interferes recurringly with a person's health, job, or society, including family. That was 1976. The World Health Organization's successor was a Dr. Edwards, Dr. E.M. Edwards. And in 1977, when he took over the committee, he phrased his version of the World Health stand with as simple a definition as his predecessor. He said that alcoholism includes a condition in which alcohol is consumed to the detriment of a person's health or social functioning over a period of time. World Health Organization has always been focused, result-focused. It's always defined something in terms of the results that occur from it. In 1981, Dr. Milam wrote a book called Under the Influence, A Guide to the Myths and Realities of Alcoholism. He was the first guy in the 80s, early 80s, to really plug away at the point that this is a primary disease. So it was Milam who in 1981 said that alcoholism is a chronic primary hereditary disease which progresses from an early physiological susceptibility into an addiction characterized by tolerance changes, physiological dependence, and loss of control over drinking. He always added that psychological symptoms are secondary to the physiological disease and not relevant to its onset. In other words, he's saying the psychological stuff that you see come out of alcoholics is secondary to the physical disease. He's making the point that this is an independent disease. It's not the result of poor psychology. Keep that in mind. The Center for Alcohol Studies is headed by Mark Keller. In 1982, he published his book called A Dictionary of Words About Alcohol. You'll find this definition on page 20. Alcoholism is, quote, a chronic disease or a symptom of an underlying psychic or physical disorder characterized by dependence on alcohol for relief from psychic or physical distress or for gratification from intoxication itself. In other words, either to relieve pain or have fun. And characterized by a consumption of alcoholic beverages sufficient and consistent enough to cause physical or mental or social or economic disability. The dependence is manifested by loss or impairment of control over drinking. Getting tougher and tougher to hang on to what's that keeps being included and what's being left behind. Here's one of the most significant pieces of research we have on the issue of addiction. It was in a book written by Dr. George Valiant, Harvard professor, physician, psychiatrist, who wrote his book called The Natural History of Alcoholism. In that book, representing now 4 to 5 decades, that's 40 to 50 years, of longitudinal research. In other words, tracking people over a 40-year period of time. So he's got some information, some data that's invaluable because he's seen not just the after version, he's seen the history. That was the point of his book, The Natural History, is to show that this isn't a static process. This is something that happens over time. Now, he'd be the guy who could tell us whether or not there was an alcoholic personality, wouldn't he? Because he's watched it over 40 years. So was there a personality at the beginning that caused alcoholism? He thinks not. But his definition was this. Alcoholism becomes a disease when loss of voluntary control over alcohol consumption becomes a necessary and sufficient cause for much of an individual's social, psychological, and physical morbidity. George Vaillant. 1983, representing long-term, longitudinal research. Keep his in mind. The American Society of Addiction Medicine and the group that sponsors this program, the National Council for Alcoholism and Drug Dependence, got together and they formed a definition that both agreed on. And it reads, alcoholism is a primary chronic disease with genetic, psychosocial, and environmental factors influencing its development and manifestations. The disease is often progressive and fatal. It is characterized by continuous or periodic impaired control over drinking, by preoccupation with the drug alcohol, by use of alcohol despite adverse consequences, and by distortions in thinking, most notably denial. So in 1990, these two groups, ASAM and NCADD, got together, and that's what they came up with. The Committee on Pain Management, headed by Dr. Savage, etc., in 2003, represent one of the early times in which the language shift. Now, we're not defining alcoholism, we're defining addiction. It's interesting that the pain management group wants to define addiction without reference to physical dependence. So they're not going to require that someone gets the shakes. Why? Because they're the group that gives out the meds that'll give you the shakes. Okay? So they have to take a position in which physical dependence is not essential to the definition. And in fact, it's not. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, number 5, does not require a patient to be physically dependent before he's called dependent. Doesn't require the shakes. So here's the Savage in 2003 says addiction is a primary. That means it's not caused by something else. It has its own causative factors. Chronic means it never goes away. Neurobiologic, that means not psychologic, but nervous system biologic. Addiction is a primary chronic neurobiologic disease with multiple factors: genetic, psychosocial, and environmental factors. It is characterized by behaviors that include one or more of the following: compulsive use, continued use despite harm, and craving. Notice, doesn't require physical dependence. The National Institute on on Drug Abuse, NIDA, headed now by a Dr. Nora Volko, interesting, fascinating woman, smart lady. She's done research herself, so she's not just an administrator. On their website, here's the definition you'll read. Again, the shift is in language. It's addiction now that we're talking about, not just alcoholism. Addiction is a chronic, often relapsing brain disease that causes compulsive drug seeking, and use despite harmful consequences to the individual that is addicted and to those around him. So it's compulsive drug seeking. Drug addiction is a brain disease because the abuse of drugs leads to changes in the structure and function of the brain. Although it is true that for most people the initial decision to take drugs is voluntary, over time the changes in the brain caused by repeated drug abuse can affect a person's self-control and ability to make sound decisions, and at the same time send impulses, intense impulses, to take the drug. So, the truth is, some people can't keep it up long enough. A good many social drinkers will tell you that drinking isn't a pleasure. It's only a pleasure with one or two drinks. After that, it feels toxic to me. So a social drinker, when we say a social drinker controls his drinking through willpower, the truth is it's not willpower. It's the fact that after a second drink, he feels toxic. He recognizes the poison effect. So, 3 guys go out drinking, 2 alcoholics, the third one non-alcoholic. The third one will stop after the second because he gets dizzy, groggy, sleepy, and sick. In other words, he feels poisoned. The other 2 will keep drinking because they don't feel dizzy, groggy, sleepy, and sick. They are tolerant. They can hold more. They don't show the toxic effects. They finally show them. Of course, you have to have the 12th drink before they'll show it. But they have no built-in natural protection against excess. They can just keep drinking more. So the notion that it's willpower, it's not at all the case. It's brain signals that keep them from drinking too much. The Mayo Clinic staff got together. I love these kinds of definitions because they're almost always down home. They got together and said alcoholism is a chronic and progressive disease that includes problems controlling your drinking, being preoccupied with alcohol, continuing to use alcohol even when it causes problems, having to drink more to get the same effect, or having withdrawal symptoms when you rapidly decrease or stop drinking. If you have alcoholism, you cannot consistently predict how much you will drink, how long you will drink, and what consequences will occur from your drinking. The oldest definition isn't a definition at all, and if you look in the book Alcoholics Anonymous, they never define alcoholism. The purpose wasn't to be a treatise on alcoholism, it was simply to help other people with the same problem get sober. That's the only intention. So the closest thing you get to a definition is what they call the first step. We admitted we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable. So that's it. We've asked the experts to sit down. They've all weighed in on their definitions. So what do they agree on? Do they agree that alcoholism must involve, of the 3 types, a certain type of alcohol? In other words, that it requires whiskey, not beer. No, doesn't require that. But how many people do you know or have you heard say, well, he can't be an alcoholic, he drinks only beer. You can be a beer alcoholic, you can be a wine alcoholic, you can be a whiskey alcoholic. Alcohol is the same in all of those drugs. The amount differs by volume, but it's the alcohol that makes you feel happy. Do the experts agree it's the amount? No. In fact, one of those definitions says specifically it has little to do with the amounts of alcohol consumed. So, and yet, do we as a society tend to believe that all alcoholics are heavy drinkers? Yeah, I think so. So, again, the myth doesn't stack with the experts, at least. Time of day you drink, that's it, right? Drink in the morning, you're in. And if you don't drink in the morning, you're safe. You're safe. No, there are morning drinkers and afternoon drinkers and evening drinkers. There are binge drinkers and regular drinkers. and daily drinkers. So is it frequency? No, they don't agree on that. It doesn't matter whether you drink in the morning or not, whether you're a binge drinker. There are three classic forms. One is regular drinking. Weekend alcoholic is a typical example of that. He goes to work every day, but on the weekends, his alcoholism shows clearly. Daily drinkers. There are some who drink every day. They're not even intoxicated every day, but they drink every day. They sort of stave off the wolf, if you know what I mean. And then there are, what did I say? And then there are binge drinkers. These are people who will go sometimes long periods of time without a drink, without even desiring a drink. Okay? So they'll go months. In one case, a relative of mine, as a matter of fact, one time went 4 years without a drink. He got suddenly thirsty. He left town, he had a chicken farm, lost his chicken farm, and stayed drunk for a year. Stopped after the year, and was abstinent for another year. Would go off his abstinence period and binge for 2 weeks. At one point, he shit his pants and sold his blood. And then he'd stop. They're kind of mysteries because it seems to come in waves with them. So they're daily, regular, and binge drinkers. So it doesn't matter really how often they drink. The experts don't agree to that. I know it's the number of years you drink. Do the experts agree on that? They do not. They do not. I have known 15-year-old alcoholics. I've known 13-year-old alcoholics. I knew an alcoholic who quit school because he wanted to drink. That's powerful motivation. I've also known 75-year-old alcoholics. So some didn't get sick for a long, long time. It had a low and slow progression, You meet an American Indian, he's an alcoholic by 21. You meet an Irishman, he's about 38. You meet an Italian, he's 62. So they all have different rates at which they end up sick. But it doesn't matter how many years you've been at it. Your age, doesn't matter. They don't agree on it anyway. Sex, it's a male disease. My God, certainly not a male disease. Women are doing a real great job of demonstrating alcoholism. They've caught right up with the men, I promise you that. Okay? The problem with women is, we used to say, if you don't see them by the time they're 30 years old, you might not see them until they're 60 years old, because they'll disappear into the health system, and they'll be diagnosed improperly. They'll miss the alcoholism. They'll be diagnosed psychiatrically more often because they seem to do a better job of behaving themselves in polite society. Men don't give a shit. They'll fight us. If they'll fight you in a bar, they don't give a crap. They'll be called tough. If a woman fights you in a bar, she's called a bitch. It's the reason for using. That's it. That's it. Alcoholics drink to escape reality. Well, first of all, do the experts agree on that? No, they don't. So is that true or false? Is it that alcoholics drink to escape reality? True or false? How many people think true? How many people think false? How many people don't know what they think? Well, the answer is true and false. It depends on when you ask the question. Okay? If you ask the question at the beginning of alcoholism, the answer is no. No. That alcoholics start drinking for the same reasons that everybody starts drinking. Because they heard it made you feel good. It looked like the thing to do. It was social. My father offered it to me. The answers go on, and they're no different for alcoholics and non-alcoholics. What happens afterwards different, but at the start. Here's the biggest myth of all. What drives teenage drinking is peer, fill in the blank, pressure. You know what that is? Best clinical language I can think of? Bullshit. That's what that is. Whoever made it up has not talked to kids. If you ask kids, why did you start? And not make it clear what you don't want their knee-jerk reaction. If you don't, define peer pressure, they'll say peer pressure. But when you say, look, peer pressure means that there's an external force and they're pushing you to drink, and if you don't want to drink or say no, they'll keep at it and they'll call you a pussy if you don't drink. That's pressure. Outside at you. Let me present you another alternative to peer pressure as the force that moves that drinking. It's peer acceptance. In other words, you didn't start drinking because someone pushed you to drink. You started drinking because you wanted to fit in. You wanted to have fun too. Your friends were doing it. You wanted to not be isolated. You wanted to be part of the gang. You wanted to be part of the group. You wanted to connect. Not because some said, if you don't drink, you're a wuss. How many of you recognize that as the force that was at work when you first started drinking? It's exactly what was at the. It's not peer pressure, it's peer acceptance. Okay? And that's why they continue. Some of them will mature out. Some of them won't mature out till they're college seniors. Someone will take a few years after that before they mature out, but some will mature out. A few will keep it up. Those are the ones who have the proneness for addiction. So the truth is that if you ask the question before, the answer is no, there's no such thing as pain causes drinking. It's acceptance. Can you think of anything more profoundly human than wanting to fit in, wanting to belong? Isn't that what moves most human beings? Isn't that the will in man, is to connect? So this notion of just say no is you're trying to get a kid to say no to something that he's just said yes to. I want to connect. And you're telling him to say no to that. That's silly. It's not going to work. Why? Because it's fundamental. It's built in. It's a part of our nature to want to do that. And so if you're trying to get kids to just say no, it seems to me the silliest goddamn reason, approach in all the world. Now, if you ask the same question at the end of alcoholism, do alcoholics drink to escape reality after 20 years of alcoholic drinking? The answer is yes. They are drinking to escape the reality that drinking caused. So 20 years later, you got a guy who's lost his family, his job, his self-respect, who is ashamed of every act he takes, every drink he takes. And at that stage, 30 years after starting, 20 years, 10, whatever it happens to be, he's changed. He needs to escape reality now because reality is painful, and it's painful because of his drinking. So the notion that it's the reason he drinks isn't so. Unless we're talking about the end of alcoholism. Personality. All right, here's another question. How many of you still think or have heard said that there's such a thing as an alcoholic personality? How many of you have heard that? In fact, if you haven't, I don't know where the hell you've been. It's not on this planet. It's been around for a long, long time. In fact, Kitty Dukakis's picture was on the cover of Time magazine with the heading "Alcoholic Personality?" ? So, is there such a thing? Well, again, the answer is yes and no, and it depends on when you ask the question. If you ask it before alcoholism, before it takes hold, no. There are no factors of personality that have been backed by hard data that demonstrates that alcoholics all have a similar personality structure at the beginning. If you ask the same question at the end of alcoholism, the answer now is yes. There is a resultant effect on personality who poison themselves for many years. That you're likely to change if you keep using a toxin, a sedative hypnotic, over a long period of time. Remember I told you one of the most significant pieces of research has been the research at Harvard by Dr. George Vaillant, a longitudinal study. His line is that the so-called alcoholic personality isn't the cause of alcoholism, it's the result of alcoholism. Makes more sense. Makes more sense. In fact, whenever I look at this audience, I always look around and think, you know what you look like? You look like an AA meeting. You know why? If you went to AA, you'd see people just like you. And I bet I can't tell who's alcoholic in this room and who isn't. And I bet you can't, unless you know the guy that you walked in with or the gal. So the truth is, no, the before personality is as remarkably different as human beings who walk the earth. At the end of a process of compulsive drinking, people have changed. And so now they share some similarities. So we can say there, I don't like the phrase alcoholic personality. I always use the phrase the personality of addiction. Alcoholic personality always sounds to me like it's predictive, so I can see the future. Personality of addiction, I think, suggests, I think of it as a resultant personality, not a causative one. And the experts don't agree on it. In fact, I don't know of anyone in this country at this time who is studying the alcoholic personality. Nobody's trying to figure out, well, what did they all share in common before they started drinking this way? It's your family upbringing. It's the way your parents raised you. Do the experts agree? No, they don't. Does it run in families? Yes, it does. How long have we known that? A long time. Why does it run in families? The world has suggested that we stop wasting our time trying to figure out what are the causative factors and stop debating whether or not it's how you're raised by your family and take a closer look at the genetics that are involved in alcoholism. So, very few people are now looking at are genetic factors involved. They're wondering which genetic factors are involved, not whether they're involved. So yeah, if your parents are alcoholic, your rate of alcoholism in that group is significantly higher than it is when the family history is negative. But that's not how your parents raised you. That's not whether or not your mom and dad were good or bad. Physical dependence. Do the experts agree that you got to get the shakes before you're an alcoholic? They do not agree. They do not agree. No one, in fact, of all those definitions, there's only one that mentions physical dependence. Physical dependence hasn't been required as a criteria for the diagnosis, the more serious diagnosis as dependence. It hasn't been necessary as a criteria for many years. It's not a part of the DSM-5. It wasn't a part of the DSM-4 TR. And yet people still have stuck in their heads as you got to get the shakes or you have to collapse from too much cocaine. No, it doesn't require physical dependence. It requires other criteria, specific criteria. And those criteria are very easily said. You need a little more explanation than just the words. But if you have a pattern of loss of control in the presence of tolerance, and you persist in drinking despite recurring problems, and that pattern has gone on for more than a year, you have addiction criteria. I would never say to someone who had told me that you can drink safely again. I'd tell them you can't. You're going to find that you continue to lose control. Your tolerance won't change until the late in the disease, then it'll get unpredictable. And you'll probably reach the point in which no matter what happens in your life because of drinking, you'll keep drinking it. So, what do the experts agree on? Well, they agree that alcohol is used, and use causes problems. That's pretty much it. Loss of control is suggested by all of them. They all hint around that, talk around that, but unfortunately they don't all agree to what the words mean. Jelinek used the phrase to mean that once you start it, you couldn't cut yourself short. Keller used the same phrase to mean you can't keep from starting. So those are different definitions. So what do the experts agree? The definition sounds like it comes to this. Alcoholism or drug addiction is drinking or drugging which causes problems. If you want a definition that the experts agree on, that's it. They haven't told you why this happens, how come it happens, why to certain people and not to others. But, if you put them in the room and say you can't leave until you give us what you at least agree on, you may all walk away unhappy thinking it doesn't include everything, but at least they all agree on that. All you have to do is I think, add 2 adjectives to that. I think you could say, you need to add the adjectives recurring and serious. It's drinking or drugging which causes recurring and serious life problems. I don't think it's fair to say that if one person has had one problem, he has a serious problem. It takes recurring problems. And even if he has recurring hiccups, I'm not upset. It has to be a serious problem, not something like hiccups, okay? So the experts would seem to agree, if we add some adjectives, that alcoholism, drug addiction, is recurring, serious life problems. So it's not what you drink, when you drink, or where you drink it. It's what happens after you drink it. And these are the misconceptions, that alcoholics fit this sort of profile. They're not just the Skid Row types. Only about 5% of the nation's alcoholics are on Skid Row. That they use hard drugs or drink the hard stuff. No, marijuana is an addictive substance. You can become addicted to marijuana. Yeah. Well, it doesn't cause physical dependence. Doesn't matter. Physical dependence is not necessary criteria. It's not essential criteria. So you have alcoholics who are alcoholics, but they've never been physically dependent. They've lost control, they're tolerant, they've persisted despite problems, and it's killed them before they ever became physically dependent. They all have blackouts? No, they don't. Some have blackouts, others never had a blackout. Some have them in the early days, some in the middle days, and some at the end stage. That's only when the blackouts occur. They're not all morning drinkers. Some are morning, some drink on only weekends, some drink after work and go to work every day. They're not binge drinkers. Some are, some aren't. They get drunk every time they drink? No, they don't. There are plenty of times. My first father-in-law was a weekend beer alcoholic. He died at age 48 of a beer drinker's heart attack. They are heavy drinkers? Not necessarily. Though they tend to be heavy drinkers, some are not, especially big-time drinkers. They drink in order to get drunk? No, they don't. No, they don't. Some just, they'll tell you. Till the day they walked into AA, they'll tell you, I just drank because it made me happy. I didn't want to get drunk. Drunk was not what I was after. My problem was that once I took the first drink, I lost control. That one said more, and the second one said more, and the third one said more, I have a friend that whenever he asked her, what's your drug of choice, she said, more. I don't give a shit what it is as long as you have more of it to give me. They don't desire drunkenness. You'd think, well, they want to be that way. Some of them don't. As the disease progresses, life gets painful. And drunkenness is a reprieve from its pain. So it can get to that point, but doesn't always get to that point. And for some, they die before it's ever gotten to that point. God help us, alcoholics have all kinds of personalities. In fact, I'm going to show you. They're a result of poor parenting. That's nonsense, too. Here's the truth. An alcoholic and a drug addict is redundant. So if you tell me you're a drug addict, I know you're an alcoholic, too. They're not separate diseases. They're the same disease. One alcohol, the other drugs other. The alcoholic's drug of choice is alcohol, but he can be anywhere from 12 to 85. He comes in the colors of the human race. Asians are protected. Native Americans, terribly prone. And so here's the variety of types. You know, even a first lady or a president or two. Funny or not so funny. In fact, when I'm asked whether I think there's an alcoholic personality, I always say, yeah, but we're not sure whether it's Betty Ford or Anna Nicole Smith. Their personalities are so similar. The 18th president, manager of the Yankees, guy who drank himself to death in 1953. It does run in families. It happens to young, talented people. It runs in families. Lord rest his soul. Demi Moore, would you have guessed it? Betty Ford, would you have guessed it? This guy bled out. He passed out and hit his head on a table. Bled to death. Iron Man. Delirious on the streets of Baltimore. Terrific actor. Yeah. John McCarthy. Another very funny man. The 14th president died of cirrhosis of the liver. Ira Hayes is an amazing young man. He was a Native American. Raised the flag on Iwo Jima. Died of alcoholism. Died in a way similar to Chris Farley. This guy choked on his own vomit. His overdose was disputed. Not only Iron Man, Wonder Woman. Great actor. Joe Martin founded, and of course, you know, Tom and Dick and Harry and Mary and Helen and Jane, and the list goes on and on. Some are obvious, others not so obvious. So you say, well, what is an alcoholic? I always say, well, how do you define a diabetic? You tell me that a diabetic is a person who has diabetes, then I'll tell you that an alcoholic is a person who has alcoholism. And that's it. Now, what is an alcoholic? He's a person who has alcoholism. It's a primary disease. I mean, that's going to be the point of next week. Next week, I'm going to try to convince you that the only way that you can account for What happens to a person who has alcoholism is the notion that this is not a psychological phenomenon. It is not the result of a character weakness. It's a brain disease. That the research being done today is about how the brain responds to a particular drug, and which people are susceptible and which people are not susceptible. So that's in a nutshell. And alcohol is a drug, and alcoholism is addiction to it. And that addiction happens to certain people, not because of their character, not because of their personality, and not because of their psychological well-being or difficulties. It happens because the brain responds to the drug in a troublesome way. They develop a tolerance for it, or in some cases they always had a tolerance for it. How many people, well, I've known a bunch of alcoholics who will tell you, tolerance? I thought that was normal. I always had it, you know. I thought everybody should be able to drink this way. And the ones who couldn't, we thought they were sissies somehow, you know. They were the nerds. Us tough guys, we were tolerant. What a terrible mistake that was. So I'll see you next week. We'll take on a tougher question. Is this a disease or not? So I'll see you next Wednesday.